Welcome into Hand Raised Guys, presented by Comer Heating and Air, Southern Air Conditioning and Heating. I'm Neal McCready. Tonight on the show, I'll visit with O State Illustrated's Jeff Johnson about Saturday's Ole Miss Oklahoma State basketball game, former OSU quarterback Spencer Sanders, and a little bit about Cowboys baseball as well. Then, speaking of baseball, Chase Parham spends about an hour with Joe Healy of D1Baseball.com to give you an SEC baseball primer. They go around the league, discuss the teams, also weigh in on some big picture topics with the sport and the conference. Joe is one of the leaders of D1Baseball.com's SEC coverage expansion, which is called SEC Extra. Hand Raised Guys is presented by Comer Heating and Air, Southern Air Conditioning and Heating, different names, but same great products, same great services. If you live in Oxford, Batesville, or the surrounding area, call Comer 662-801-1777. If you live in Hernando, Memphis, or the surrounding area, call Southern 662-429-4429. This will, of course, be the Friday Oxford Exxon podcast. Oxford Exxon, Highway 6 West in Oxford. They've been sponsoring this podcast for going on 10 years now. Stop by on your way in or out of Oxford. Always clean, always great place to fill up both your vehicle and yourself. Always check out the ribs as well. We got Championship Sunday in the NFL. Stop by, get some ribs, both dry and wet. Make that a part of your Championship Sunday, the NFC Championship game, 2 p.m., the Niners and the Eagles on Fox. And then the AFC Championship game, the Bengals and the Chiefs from Kansas City, 5:30 on CBS. So a perfect day to enjoy some ribs from the Oxford Exxon. I'm coming to you from the Clark Ford Studios. 662-257-1900 is the number to call. Ask for Corey Clark. Tell Corey what Ford product you're looking for. He'll send you a quote within 15 minutes in business hours. It's right to the bottom line. There's no hassle. There's no haggle. You get your quote. The rest is completely up to you. You could shop that quote around, or you can do what I've done, what I recommend that you do, and that's hop into a Clark Ford today. 662-257-1900. The people at Clark Ford want to be your car guy. They want to be your truck guy. They'll prove to you what that means when you make the call. Again, 662-257-1900. Jeff Johnson, Joe Healy, all guests join on the MyPerfectFranchise.net hotline. Are you a displaced corporate executive wanting to put your career in your own hands? Maybe you are an experienced entrepreneur just wanting to diversify. Either way, Andy Ludicky can help. He's a longtime Rivals board member, a diehard college football fan, a franchise veteran. He owns multiple franchises and businesses. He uses his expertise to help others find their American dream through a very thorough and free consultation process. So call Andy, put your life and your career in your own hands. It's 100% free. You got nothing to lose. Find your perfect franchise at myperfectfranchise.net. Call Andy at any time at 404-973-9901 or send him an email, Andy at myperfectfranchise.net. Now, here's my interview with OStateIllustrated.com's Jeff Johnson. My colleague Jeff Johnson covers Oklahoma State for OStateIllustrated.com. It's part of the Rivals.com network. Jeff, really appreciate you coming on, spending a few minutes with us.
You bet, Neal.
All right, we'll touch on basketball real quick. I want to get into Spencer Sanders because you've covered a lot of Spencer Sanders. You can tell us what happened, what went wrong, what went right with Spencer Sanders at OSU. Real quick, we'll touch on basketball. Ole Miss is 1-7 in the SEC. It certainly appears we're headed towards an off-season of change, but they go to Stillwater on Saturday night. I think the game's on ESPN2 or ESPNU or one of the ESPNs.
One of those, yeah.
If you want to find it, you can. It's obviously a non-story here at this point. How big of a story is O State basketball right now? The Big 12 looks loaded.
The Big 12 is loaded, and that has made Mike Boynton's life that much more difficult. Boynton is a fantastic guy. He's just a great human being, fantastic recruiter. What type of coach he is, I think, is still very much up as a question. He's pretty good assembler of talent. This particular team, if he had a point guard and had a guy that could really shoot the three, they'd be really, really dangerous. As it stands now, they play really good defense. They protect the rim extremely well and can play well offensively in spurts. They are kind of a dangerous team as far as that goes, but it's not a consistent dangerous type team at all. So they're real up and down, and you never really know what you're going to get from game to game.
I'm curious. I'm going to throw you a quick little curveball here that I didn't discuss with you previously, but I'm thinking about it
Okay.
now. Big 12 basketball. Obviously, Texas just went through the change with Chris Beard.
Mm-hmm.
Chris Beard's name is going to pop up everywhere because he obviously is a terrific basketball coach.
He really is.
Separating that from his personal life. What do you hear in Big 12 circles about Beard's hireability this offseason?
Right now in the Big 12, I'd say it's pretty well close to zero. Now, I think as time goes on, more and more is going to emerge from that whole situation, and not that he's going to come out of that deal clean by any stretch of the imagination, but it takes two to tango a lot of times in those situations, based on what we've heard. If we hadn't heard more details, I'd be real hesitant to say that, but in the end, it may come out that both people were kind of at fault, and it went a bad direction. And the man's usually going to be the one that goes to jail in that situation. So maybe his hireability comes up quite a bit. Certainly, he's a fantastic basketball coach, and we've seen examples within the Big 12. I guess more on the football side, Art Briles. That type of guy is eventually going to get another shot. The guy that can really coach, if he's able to redeem himself, his reputation a little bit, somebody's going to hire him and give him a shot, and hope that there's no additional issues. And I would guess in Beard's case, I don't know him personally, but would guess that that's not going to be an ongoing problem.
Interesting. All right, let's talk about Spencer Sanders. I'll be honest. With the first time I heard Spencer Sanders to Ole Miss was as at least a month ago, maybe a little more, and I dismissed it in my mind. I was like, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Ole Miss has Jackson Dart. He just played.
Yeah, it didn't make a lot of sense from when I was hearing it either.
Yeah, so and then it kept gaining steam, and at one point, I don't remember exactly when, someone said, "Yeah, it's real," and then it got really real, and he's committed. He is getting into the technicalities here. He is admitted but not yet enrolled. They're trying to work out some academic things. It's my understanding he's in Oxford. I think he's gone through workouts, but he's got to get enrolled before he can go through spring practice, which isn't until late March. There's some time there. Let's start here here's a guy that played a ton of games at Oklahoma State, played in some really big games as Oklahoma State's quarterback, was, at least in my eyes, and look, I'm not a guy I cover the SEC. Oklahoma State's not in the SEC. I don't follow them closely. But if you told me in September, say, Oklahoma State, face of the program, I would have said, well, it's Mike Gundy and Spencer Sanders.
Yep.
How did they get to this place where Spencer Sanders, who still had time eligibility left, how did he get to a place where the two sides parted ways?
That's the big question on the Oklahoma State side of it. Certainly, I've heard some of that. There are internal things with the team that even guys like you and me aren't really privy to that go down. But you can kind of see, even just as a casual fan, something went down during the course of the season. You had a big lead or not a big lead, but a lead on TCU, and quite frankly, should have won that game. Give it up. They win at the end, and then you turn around and go to Kansas State and lay the single biggest egg of Mike Gundy's career. I forget the final on that, but it was something like 45-0. And from that point forward, it was a completely different team. You're talking about a team that they pull off that win with TCU over TCU. They're sitting at 6-0. With arguably the toughest part of their schedule behind them, and then proceed to look pretty bad all the rest of the way through the season. Sanders was dinged up in that TCU game, and that affected his play the rest of the season, his ability to play in the first place, and then when he did play, how well he was able to play. And, as far as Spencer Sanders' career at Oklahoma State has gone, that's always been a big factor. He's been dinged up, if not outright injured, pretty much every year. I don't think it's a fragility issue. The guy's a pretty tough tough kid, tough player. He plays a tough brand of football, and that leads to injuries, as time goes on. He's got a little bit of a unique throwing motion, which has caused him some shoulder issues in the past. I think that was a play a little bit this year. Mike Gundy is one of those guys at this point that gives basically no injury information whatsoever. If a guy volunteers it on his own, that's about all we're going to get. But have heard that shoulder issues were part of Spencer's injury issues this year. But anyway, circling back to something changed within that team, the locker room, the dynamic there, and Spencer being the fifth-year quarterback, his fourth year as a starter, was certainly right in the mix of that. To what degree any blame falls on him, I don't really know.
You talked about him as a player. Let's dive into a little bit more there. What kind of a player is he? I mean, again, when I watched, I was like, okay, this is this kind of a multi-talented, athletic kid who's doesn't have an elite arm, doesn't have elite wheels, but is good at both. Is kind of multifunctional. But like you said, he gets banged up. A lot of quarterbacks do. There's a reason NFL teams put so much focus on the quarterback not getting hit. You want your quarterback healthy. The Gundy offense uses the quarterback as a runner some, in much the same way as the Kiffin offense. When he's healthy, how good of a player is he? And, what kind of just give us a breakdown on what kind of quarterback he is.
He's a little bit of a throwback to a former OSU quarterback. You probably remember Zach Robinson. The kid was pretty good. Zach would tell you outright he didn't feel like he was in a game until he got hit one time pretty good. And I don't recall Spencer ever saying that, but he plays that way.
Yeah.
That he doesn't, and again, in Zach's words, he didn't feel like the game was really going, and he was really on point until he took that first shot, and then he was good to go from that point forward. Spencer has always played that way. I don't know I've ever heard him vocalize it exactly that way, but just watching him play, that's the type of player he is. You nailed it. Good arm, good wheels, not great at either. I think he actually has pretty great vision. That's what allowed him to be a real threat in the run game, despite not necessarily having the best wheels and playing behind some offensive lines the last couple of years that were really not very good, either at pass protection or in the run game. And he was still a threat. And I think it had as much to do with vision and toughness as it did his wheels necessarily.
Were you surprised, Jeff, when he got in the portal?
Yes, somewhat. And I can tell you Oklahoma State was surprised because, a week prior to him entering the portal, they had set him down with the collective, talk about NIL deal. There was agreement on both sides. He said, yeah, I'm good. I'm good to play in the bowl game. And then I think it was less than a week later, he's in the portal, which surprised everybody at Oklahoma State. Now, you've talked to Spencer, you may get a different side of the story on that, but that's what I've heard from the Oklahoma State perspective of we thought he was back for the bowl game and back for next year, and then looked up and, hey, he's in the portal. So had to take off and run with it from there. The other important thing to note on Sanders' game on the field is he's definitely been injury prone. I mentioned that before, and then turnover prone. And towards the end of his career, maybe the last 2 years, less turnover prone than he had been. The first couple of seasons as a starter, he was good for a couple of turnovers a game, either interception or fumble or both, or maybe multiples of both. The last 2 seasons, he tended to be more of a guy who protected the ball pretty well most games, but then would have a really bad game here or there. Thinking back to the 2021 season, Big 12 championship game with Baylor. So they played twice, obviously, that year. I think he had 7 total turnovers in those 2 games. And obviously, Oklahoma State lost the Big 12 title game, had a chance to win it, had 7 tries from inside the 5 to win that game, didn't get it done. The regular season game, he had 4 turnovers in that game. They still managed to win. But it's always a factor when you're looking at Sanders in his game, is he is prone to turn over turn over the football. I think it's a little bit of the riverboat gambler type mentality that makes him a really good runner. Is he's going to take some chances, and that's both running the football and trying to fit a ball in a small window in the passing game. And sometimes it bites him, and they tend to snowball a little bit.
It's what's so interesting about the fit with Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss. If you listen to insiders talk at Ole Miss, Kiffin's frustration with Jackson Dart has been decision making. And he wasn't a turnover machine, had some turnover games, and those turnovers always frustrated Kiffin. He would make comments about them, about decision making. And in many ways, Dart and Sanders often sound like the same guy in terms of as a quarterback. Yep. There's a lot of similarities between the two of them. When he got in the portal, his academics are complicated. Did you hear specific teams early? How much choice did he have when he decided he wasn't going to stay at Oklahoma State?
I think it wound up being a whole lot less choices than he thought he had. I don't know, Neal, how much you've dealt with NIL and the collective or collectives there at Ole Miss. I've had a chance to talk with one former player who's pretty involved in Oklahoma State's collective. The effect of agents on these guys that are getting in the portal as it relates to NIL can't really be understated. Family members are the other one. If they don't have an agent, they've got a family member or a friend of the family that's advising them. And a lot of guys are here, and you can get so much more here or there. And in some cases, that's true, I guess. But a lot of these cases, they're getting in the portal and finding out, wait, I just left a way better deal at home than I'm finding in the portal at all. I'll give you an example. Colin Oliver, who's a defensive end quarterback rush specialist at Oklahoma State, had a freshman All-America type year, not quite as good as sophomore year. He's represented by one of the handful of agents that you say this guy's name and everybody knows who he is. That guy told him when he was kicking around, maybe entering the portal and seeing what was out there, he said, "Don't. You're insane. Your value is higher in Stillwater, Oklahoma than it's going to be anywhere else in the country. Why would you walk away from where you actually have name recognition into a place where you don't?" So, but anyway, to some degree that occurred with Spencer, whether that was an agent, family member, friends, whatever. Hey, yeah, Oklahoma State made you a pretty awesome offer through the collective, but you could do better. And I think that's influencing guys all across the country, and way too many of them are getting in the portal and finding out, that wasn't really true.
What's interesting here is obviously Jackson Dart started 12 of 13 games. He comes back as the incumbent. He believes it's his team. He believes it's his locker room. They go out and get Walker Howard out of the portal, but Walker's got a full 4 years of eligibility remaining.
Right.
And, so Walker is just wants to be able to compete for the job, make sure he gets at least number 2 snaps so that he can get going. You bring in Sanders, and it just stands to reason that if Jackson Dart and Spencer Sanders are both on the roster in September, someone's not happy. Knowing what you know of Spencer Sanders, would he have transferred to a place like Ole Miss without not the promise of starting, because I don't think anybody gives a promise, but without at least feeling like, hey, I'm going to be the starting quarterback?
No, I don't think he would have, but there is a but there. And that but would be if he had no other real legitimate other opportunities. Coming back to Oklahoma State, at one point, I think that was on the table. Spencer has said via Twitter, just some comments that he never asked to come back to Oklahoma State. Everybody I've talked to on the Oklahoma State says, well, no, that's actually not true. He did twice. But wherever the truth lies in that story, and it's always typically, as we know, somewhere in the middle. At the end of it, I don't think Oklahoma State would have taken him back for anything, and I don't think Spencer would have come back to Oklahoma State for anything.
Why?
By the time it got to, Ole Miss being a serious candidate and all that, I think it was just the situation where everybody looked at it and said, you know what, a new start's best for everybody in this deal. So we're just both going to go our separate ways, and hopefully down the road, Spencer could show back up in Stillwater, and people celebrate the great career he did have at Oklahoma State. But it ended messy. I think I said that in a text message to you a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
It was a messy end, and at the end of the day, for both sides, I think it was best to move on. I think, pertinent to your question, though, yes, I would expect that Spencer's coming in expecting to either be the guy or have a full out, quarterback battle, classic quarterback battle that you don't see all that often anymore. Either that, or he just really didn't have any other better options.
If he is not the guy, you've been around this guy for a while. He strikes me as the alpha male type. There's no lack of confidence on his part that I can tell. If he's not the guy and he's not even getting a lot of number 2 snaps because Walker Howard's getting those, what kind of influence do you see him having on a locker room? Is he the guy that would be a veteran leader, or is he the guy that could become pretty disgruntled publicly?
I could definitely see it going the latter. Not being happy. Now, that may not necessarily turn into a disgruntled, face of the program. It could turn more into seeing how things go in spring, if he's able to go through spring, which, as you hit on, you know more about where he stands on that than I do. But goes through spring and is looking like the number 2 guy. I could see him hitting the portal again. And then it would go back to his academics.
Yeah. Any chance at all? I'm curious here. Mike Gundy's got to go through the spring too, right? So he's going to, and before people get mad, I'm just exploring this option. Because I think in the end, it's likely, knowing what I know about college football, and you probably will agree with this, Jeff, that there are some hurdles, but usually schools find a way to jump the hurdles. They get them jumped. And he'll go through spring, and once he does that, I don't even know how the whole portal thing works. Is there any scenario where, in the event that he couldn't get cleared to go through spring, Mike Gundy looks at his quarterback situation in April and says, you know what, I'm going to have to swallow some ego here?
Yeah, there are scenarios. Alan Bowman, formerly at Texas Tech, but most recently Michigan, where he was a third stringer, but also has done some really impressive things in the Big 12 as a young guy, especially. He tore Oklahoma State up a couple different times, but he comes in and that just doesn't work, or more to the point, I guess, that he gets hurt. Let's say, he blows out his shoulder. That's a scenario where I think Mike Gundy would at least have to look at it, but I don't think he would do it. And I think that's an ego thing. I think it's why Sanders worked so well for him as a quarterback, because that's the guy Mike Gundy was as a quarterback in a lot of respects. I see a lot of similarities there, and I see ego getting in the way of probably both sides in that scenario. We never say never by any means, but like I said before, I think it really came down to both sides looking at it and saying, you know what, it's just best to make this split, rip the Band-Aid off, and go our separate ways. And I don't see either side, honestly, trying to come back on that.
All right, I went negative with one question, so I'll go the complete opposite here as we complete this conversation. In a scenario where he comes in and wins the job, gets eligible, wins the job, you've seen Spencer Sanders take Oklahoma State to some pretty lofty places.
Absolutely.
When he's healthy and he's the guy, what kind of a leader is he? Because again, he strikes me from my time watching him as this guy that immensely confident, a ton of swagger, makes plays. When he's on top of his game, when he's the guy, what's the ceiling for him?
I'd say there really isn't a major ceiling. Don't want to go there because we don't even know if he's going to be the guy, but he puts it all together, stays healthy, which, as we talked about, it's a real key. And leads Ole Miss to really high heights next year. Heisman's not out of the question. He's that type of player. I mean, he's got that type of skill. Leadership wise, when things are going well, he's really, really good. This year was the first year that we really got a glimpse after he was that experienced guy. He struggled. The team struggled at times as freshman and redshirt freshman and sophomore seasons. But he wasn't that guy necessarily. I mean, he was QB1, but not the older guy. So out of the last 2 years, 2022 was the first year we saw, and quite honestly, for him personally and as a team, the struggle was bigger this year than at any point in his career, even when he was a young guy and not necessarily the alpha leader. I don't think he particularly handled adversity well this year. But I think a lot of that falls on coaching and guys around him as well. It's definitely not 100% Spencer Sanders deal there. There was a lot that went wrong for Oklahoma State as QB1. As we both know, that guy, other than the head coach, probably has more face time and therefore shoulders more blame and more credit. When things are going well, maybe more credit than they should, but that's the way it is in big time college football anymore.
Things have changed a lot in big time college football. Gundy has been the face of OSU for 2 decades. It feels like.
We're getting real close. 18 years.
Is he getting to the place where, hey, it's been awesome, but you're going to have to prove it again, or is he basically have a lifetime contract there?
It's getting towards that point of, and that's the thing. It's tough if you're Gundy's boss, who's new at the job, by the way, to say, well, you had a down year this year, still went to a bowl for the 17th year in a row, but you're on a hot seat here. That being said, the portal exodus, I think at last count, Oklahoma State had 18 guys that went in the early period. And I think 16 of those were scholarship guys, along with several current or projected starters next season. That caught the attention of, his bosses at Oklahoma State, the Board of Regents. So there's probably more pressure there than there's been on Mike Gundy in quite some time. You go to 17 bowls in a row as the school who had a very long bowl drought for a number of years. The 1988 Barry Sanders Heisman campaign, they didn't go to another one until 97. So, and then there was another 4, 5, 6 year gap there. That means a lot at Oklahoma State to put together, and not just a bull streak, but there's been a number of double-digit wins seasons in there as well. So one bad half of a season, I don't think puts him on a red hot seat by any means, but the transfer portal and NIL have changed things. And I think everybody who touches college football in any way, and that's an athletic director, a president of a university, says, whoa, the game has changed. We need to be on top of this. And I think that all factors in and ratchets everything up for everybody all across the country, really.
Last thing, Chase Parham and Joe Healy are about to talk for an hour plus on college baseball at the end of this interview on this show. So I'll ask you about Oklahoma State. They had a hell of a season last year, hosted a regional that ended up being probably one of the more entertaining ones with Oklahoma State and Arkansas at the end. A lot of SEC talk, obviously, going into the college baseball season, as is expected and is appropriate given the results. But Oklahoma State's one of those teams outside of the SEC that is talked about as a contender. How good is this Cowboys team going to be?
Rankings are starting to come out. In fact, I think pretty much all of them got a dog barking there. All of them preseason wise have come out. Oklahoma State's been anywhere from 9 to 18, I think. I think that's probably about right, kind of that range, and maybe not at the high or the low end of it, kind of in between. They've added some pieces. Pitcher out of Long Beach, that his name is slipping my mind, but he was picked yesterday as the Big 12 Newcomer of the Year and Pitcher of the Year by the coaches. You got Nolan McLean coming back, two-way guy. Turned down his first pick of the third round last year. Turned down the money and to come back. You have to think he thinks he's going to improve his stock both ways. A lot of returners off that team last year have added a few key pieces, and they should be one of the better teams in the country.
Yeah, should be a lot of fun when college baseball rolls around. It's obviously a huge deal here. People follow a lot of it.
It is. The Big 12 basketball and SEC baseball or carry a lot of parallels, I think, just because there's no day off in the SEC. And Big 12 baseball is pretty salty as well, but it's probably not at the same level top to bottom as SEC. And certainly, I can tell you from having been, my son played travel baseball for years, been over at Baum, seen some of those crowds at Arkansas. The Big 12 still got a lot of work to do as far as game day atmosphere and pulling crowds. And, I think Oklahoma State took a big step with the stadium they built here recently. It's as nice as any place in the country. And you just need the play on the field to go with it. And Josh Holliday's been pretty good. So they're still working on that SEC crowd and atmosphere type thing in the Big 12. And, Oklahoma State's maybe leading the way there.
Jeff, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
You bet, Neal.
Again, our thanks to Jeff Johnson for his time earlier today on the show. We'll shift gears. We talked baseball there at the end. A lot of baseball coming your way. Ole Miss baseball still a few weeks away, but that didn't stop Chase Parham from getting Joe Healy of D1Baseball.com on the line. And they talk for a little bit more than an hour about Ole Miss baseball, SEC baseball, and more. If you like college baseball, you will love the following conversation with Chase and Joe Healy of D1Baseball.com.
D1Baseball.com. I guess I should say SEC Extra now as well. Joe Healy joining us here on the podcast. Joe, glad to have you. First time here on the show. We're talking a bit of SEC baseball today. Obviously, some Ole Miss with our fan base as it is from an emphasis on that. But how's it been at D1 so far? And then tell me a little bit about the SEC Extra. I was talking about it on our podcast a few days ago, our main show, that, as the NIL gets going, and I'll get into all this, but as everything kind of trends, it does look like, what was the number one conference in baseball anyway is only getting stronger, whether it be from expansion to all the ways that resources are going in. I mean, it seems like it's not necessarily a coincidence you guys are throwing that out right now.
Yeah, no doubt. I appreciate you having me on. Happy to do it. Always a fan of the stuff that you do. Yeah, I mean, there's just really no better time for D1 baseball to jump into a project like this for all the reasons you just laid out. And it's been great working with these guys. Kendall and Aaron have been friends of mine for a long, long time, even going back before I was working at Baseball America before this. It's just you go around college baseball enough, you just run into those guys. I'm sure and so it was great. There was a fit for me, and it felt a little like coming home, just because I love this sport, and love being in a place where college baseball is the be all end all. And so that's just been I've been here. What are we looking at now? 4 months. Okay. And so, it's got my feet are fully wet now. We're knee deep in preview stuff. So excited about all that. But yeah, I mean, it's SEC Extra is really just a project, me and Mark Etheridge, and the old heads in the group who've been following college baseball for 20 plus years at this point probably remember Mark from his old sebaseball.com site, which is how I kind of got interested in SEC baseball and learned about SEC baseball. So I'm super excited. I try not to remind Mark too often that I read that site when I was in middle school and high school, because I don't think he appreciates that a lot, but that's the truth of it. That's kind of got me into SEC baseball. So it's cool to do this project with him. And the idea is just kind of to be a service to fans in of this conference that, for all the reasons you laid out, is the undoubtedly the best in pick your metric. And it is not only the best in college baseball, but is running away from the field. You and I could do an hour on just all the different reasons that is, and the metrics that show that, and all that kind of stuff. And we just want to serve those fans because they, just from a business standpoint, they've served D1 baseball well. That they're fans of D1 baseball and fans of what we do. And there were a lot of stories, frankly, in the SEC that just weren't getting told because Kendall and Aaron, and even some of their other guys they have on staff are just only so many people, right? And so I think, to speak directly to your listeners, last year's Ole Miss story, I think, is a great example. And I've said this on other radio shows and podcasts this offseason that, last year there was a lot of focus, understandably so, on Tennessee, right? And then there was a lot of focus on A&M, and everybody was so surprised to see that. And a little bit of focus on Arkansas because the team was good, but they had RPI problems. And Ole Miss was kind of this sideshow for a while because the record was what it was. And then they started kind of making their run, and it felt like everyone just kind of agreed, like, well, we'll wait and see what happens in the postseason. Because that's, if they make it, great, then we'll start talking about it. But they're probably not going to make it, right? So whatever. So there just wasn't a lot of attention paid to how they were doing it, why they were, just the how and the why behind it. With a site like SEC Extra, we're going to be all over a story like that, right? So that's kind of the idea here is like, look, D1 baseball is still going to continue to cover everything SEC baseball. But with Mark and I, what we're doing is to try to dig a little bit deeper. And instead of it being a mile wide and an inch deep, we're going to try to go a mile wide and a mile deep. And we'll see, we're going to do some things that I think are going to really work. I think we're going to do some things that aren't going to work. That's just kind of what happens when you're launching a business, but we're really excited about it.
What got you into college baseball? Why that? I mean, there's a small but dedicated crew of us that's been doing this for a really long time. I mean, I just covered Ole Miss, but I guess this is season 18 now for me. Now when I'm doing the math in my head, which it's kind of startling now that I'm doing that. I kind of hate that I just that I just did that. But yeah, that's what I did. But what you mentioned Kendall and Aaron and whatnot. But what got you into it? Why college baseball?
Two really good examples of life in a large part being about time and place. I grew up in Houston, came of age in the late 90s and early 2000s, and had several members of my family graduate from Rice University. And, anybody who knows anything about college baseball knows that like Rice is a school that's historically awful at most of the other major sports. And just, they hired Wayne Graham, and then the baseball program just took off like a rocket. And so for me, growing up in a place where you had to choose between the Aggies and Longhorns, and me being a little bit of a counterintuitive guy and kind of that guy who was a little bit of a, I tended to go against the grain as a kid. I was never a fan of the teams that my friends were, right? Like I always kind of went in a different direction. I latched onto Rice as a kid, and it helped that I had family so I could go into the games was easy and all that stuff. So that was item number one. And then item number two was I went to college at Sam Houston, which is a really good mid-major college baseball program. David Pierce, the coach at Texas now, was the head coach there, like right as I was graduating. And so I spent a lot of afternoons, they'd play these like 4 p.m. Tuesday midweek games, and I'd walk straight from class to go sit there, and I'd, study or pretend like I was going to study and not study at the ball game, and just kind of sit out there and watch baseball and, enjoy that. And then go back to the apartment for the night. It was just something it was part of my routine, and it helped that the program was good. And so had I gone to college somewhere else, maybe I would have lost that passion, but having gone there kind of allowed me to continue to dive deep into the sport.
Two things there. Sam Houston finished second in the Oxford Regional in 2007. So I watched them play in the final there when Ole Miss Ole Miss blew them out in the finals, but and ended up losing to Arizona State out in Tempe in the next week in the Super Regional. But yes, Sam Houston, I guess with David Pierce, now that you say that, I didn't really no. Was it
Mark Johnson was the coach.
Yeah, Mark Johnson. Yeah,
the longtime A&M coach. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
That team was kind of fun too, because that team hit about 340 as a club and had a team ERA that was probably 6.5. Like I don't know the numbers off the top, but like they were there to try to win a 14-12 game, and in that regional they won a couple of them like that. So it clearly was working.
Yeah, that is kind of like the model for when Ole Miss hosted all those regionals in a row those years, because in 2006 it was that Western Kentucky, the South Alabama team that was really good was in there, and then in 2009 was the Western Kentucky group that really stressed Ole Miss into the finals. It was the game Pomeranz through the kind of the gym on 2 days rest or whatever, but that Western Kentucky team could absolutely smash with Gaynor and Kreger and some of those guys back in the day. You mentioned, I'm going to get to the SEC, but I'm talking to you now and I'm all over the place just because it's college baseball. Rice for a minute there tried to kind of go to a little bit of a Vanderbilt model, tried to figure it out from a program still. Is there any future for that, or where are they kind of stuck right now?
I think there's a little bit of a future, but it's largely based on everything they've already built up, right? The facility is still good. It's starting to show its age a little bit, and I haven't been in years, so I guess I shouldn't say so definitively, but last I was there, it was starting to show a little bit of age, but it's still a very, very good facility. It was a crown jewel when they built that thing. Like it was they used to get a lot of national TV games in part because the facilities for things like TV and broadcasters and things like that were so good. It was just an easy place to go do a game, which wasn't the case in college baseball in 2008 across the board like it is now. So, and of course in Houston, there's just a ton of players, right? So you're always going to have that going for you. But I think the difference with Rice and Vanderbilt is the results were pretty similar, for a while, but the Rice administration is not on board in a way that the Vanderbilt administration was,
Sure,
and
of course.
so I think that's the big difference there, is that the Vanderbilt administration, I think in part because, like Rice, their other major sports have historically not been very good, really latched onto the baseball thing. And I think having a coach like Tim Corbin really kind of pushing for more and doing this and doing that, really kind of like not being content with what they had and really trying to push the envelope, and the administration going for that. It was just a different deal at Rice. And so, I think it was, they liked the success they were having, but it just wasn't necessarily the will to kind of continue to do different things to stay competitive as the landscape of college baseball changed, right? Because that's really part of it here too, is that, I think Rice is not alone in a certain brand of private school that had a lot of success at one point in college baseball history that is no longer quite succeeding at that level. I think of Tulane, it kind of in the same vein there. So, whether those two things are related or not, maybe it's just, anecdotal and a coincidence, but I do think there is something there that as college baseball has grown, a certain subset of schools that really hung their hat on baseball have just not been able to do so quite in the same way as more money has poured in from things that have nothing to do with baseball, like, media contracts in football for football and basketball purposes. As that money has filtered down, it's just allowed, these major conferences to run away with things. And life is hard unless you're a really, really committed mid-major program like a Southern Miss, for example, East Carolina, if you want to call that mid-major. Like, if you're not one of those, life is really tough.
Feel free to call me an idiot here. I've got a take, and I could be wrong, but Tim Corbin, he is, now to his credit, I mean, they've done so much to benefit from, but also assist their former players back in, and the reputation and the way they develop prospects and all these different things. But he was never going to take the Clemson job, but he kind of threw his name in that hat for a minute just because he seemed frustrated at Vanderbilt a little bit in the offseason when Eric Bakich gets hired. And as Vanderbilt, because of NIL or whatever, I believe Vanderbilt will fall just a touch. I mean, they'll no longer be just the preeminent number one recruiting location wherever, just because they're not going to have the same NIL resources of Arkansas or LSU or Ole Miss or whomever if they really get invested in that way. Am I crazy that in 3 years, I think Tim Corbin's coaching at a different SEC school?
I don't think you're crazy to say that he might be doing something a little different, but I've always seen Tim Corbin as less likely to have a next act as a head coach somewhere. I think I think this is just Joe's opinion. Sure. I think the next act is just as likely to be something in administration, whether that's, an AD at Vanderbilt or for some sort of job, in the NCAA level or something like that. Like, I think he's just a savvy administrator. And I think there's a reason why you look at some of the infrastructure that's around him and his baseball program. I remember my first year going to Omaha that Vanderbilt was there, which would have been 19 when they won it all. And just the amount of people they bring to that, like the support staff they have, and they've got, multiple some places send one SID and a photographer, but they had multiple people doing media for them and multiple, videographers and photographers and creative people. And I don't think that's an accident. Like, I don't think they just offered that. I think Tim Corbin is kind of thinking ahead on that kind of stuff. And so I think he's got an administrative type of brain. So, I wouldn't be surprised by really anything, especially as college baseball continues to grow. I think we're going to see more stuff where these coaches kind of have second and third acts in places we might not have expected. But I would be more likely to see him moving into something more in an administrative role. Now, the first part of what you said, I think you're right on. I think life has gotten a little harder for Vanderbilt, or could potentially. And some of this is just that it's cyclical, right? Like, it's hard to be the cat's meow for any length of time, right? Like, there's just kind of these cyclical things where water kind of tends to find its level. But I do think there are a lot of headwinds that Vanderbilt will have to deal with. And I don't think they are not ignorant to those. Like, they kind of understand what the deal is. So that's kind of the first step in fighting those. But yeah, I think, their ability to be preeminent recruiting location for players, I think is slightly diminished, which is not to say diminished altogether, because they still obviously have a lot to offer.
Of course. Yeah, jump into the SEC from an overall standpoint, and I could have done this math myself, but I'll still something that one of my podcast coworkers said a few days ago. You look at this, and in the SEC West, you have the 2022 national champions, the 2021 national champions, two teams that tied for third in the country, a team that finished sixth or fifth or sixth in the country in Auburn, the most talented team in the country by far in LSU, and then an Alabama team that is better. I think you guys have them ranked. They're improved. It's on paper as good as just a straight resume standpoint that the West has been, which is saying something considering how it is. And then you have Tennessee, who was the best team in the country last year. They by far bring a ton of guys back. Vanderbilt, as you mentioned, Florida should be really, really good. You're talking 11, 12 deep in this thing, but to decide that West, I almost feel like it's schedule influenced a little bit because we don't think Missouri is probably very good. Kentucky is down or whatever. I don't know what to make of South Carolina, but you look at it and there's at least a path to every West team being really, really good. Now I'm kind of curious about State's pitching and some different things, but the East-West kind of separation seems more than maybe we see on paper going into some seasons.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's why it's totally not off the table that, yes, LSU is the most talented team on paper, but I wouldn't be shocked to see Tennessee end up with the best record again, because they have not just gone away. For anybody out there who is hoping that this Tennessee, fever would break and it would be a totally different deal, like, brother, I got news for you. Like, it's the best rotation in college baseball. So, will they go 25-5 again? No, I don't think so. I'd be really shocked by that. But could they just win the SEC by virtue of like, hey, we get to play more games against teams that aren't going to be in regionals? Like, I totally think that's on the table. And I feel bad in the West because we got beat up, and by we, I mean D1 got beat up a little bit when we released our top 25 by Auburn fans. And I get it. Like, I totally get it. And I think Butch has proven himself as a coach that it's really hard for folks like you and I to be able to quantify coaching. Like, it's really easy for fans and even us to say like, oh, this is bad coaching. These are good coaches. These are bad coaches, all that kind of stuff. But the truth is you and I don't really know altogether.
Sure.
But he is someone I'm confident in saying, with the exception of 2021 when they were beat up. And I think the 2021 year was weird for everybody. It was the post-COVID year. He tends to get, their teams tend to be like 25% better than you think they should be every year. And they seem to overachieve on paper every year, and they do deserve some benefit of the doubt at this point. And yet, we just felt like it was hard to rank them because there's so many other teams on paper that we just like better. And so, yeah, I mean, it's tough. And, the math doesn't really work out either. It's one of the reasons why you allude to Mississippi State having questions about their pitching. I think that team will be better this year. I mean, it seems like, I think I said this on the podcast I did with Kendall and Aaron and Runes yesterday. You play out Mississippi State season 100 times, and the one we saw last year might have been the worst version of that season because they just kind of felt like they bottomed out. So I think they'll be better kind of by default this year. And I like a lot of the personnel on the position player side, but how much better can you really expect to be in that division and in this conference? Because it's not just as easy to say, okay, we're going to be better. Well, guess what? So are a lot of other teams in the conference. So ask teams like Alabama or Kentucky, like how hard it is to claw your way back up the SEC when you're trying to build something. Like, it's just tough because the teams at the top aren't going anywhere.
You mentioned Tennessee and maybe they end up with the best record. I think, yeah, I agree with you. That's very, very possible. Are we going to see, they played such a heel last year. I mean, you had Patello and Butch throwing bats at each other, and you had something every weekend, whether it be the Vanderbilt thing with the legal bats, or even when they came into Oxford and just smashed Ole Miss over those 3 days. Are we going to see a very similar DNA and attitude, or do you think Vitello calms even a little bit? I mean, what do you sort of envision just from a persona of this Tennessee team?
I think we'll see a little bit softer is maybe not the right word, but I do think there'll be a little bit less of an edge. Like, I do think there is always going to be a baseline of that in that program, because that's just, I think that is the DNA of that. And Tony obviously is the face of it, but as a pitching coach, Frank Anderson's a pretty fiery guy too. Like, it's an intense group, and that obviously works for them. But I do think we will see a little less of that. Now, some of that might just be some of the personnel, like Drew Gilbert, Jordan Beck, Jarrell Ortega. Those guys are gone, and they tended to be three of the more intense personalities on that roster. So maybe that plays a role. But I also think again, just Joe's opinion, I also think maybe they learned some lessons as the season went on. And I don't know if they necessarily regret any specific incident or anything like that, but I do wonder if what happened against Notre Dame in the Super Regional, where Notre Dame was so up to play that role of spoiler. And look, everybody's going to be up for a Super Regional, right? If you can't get up to playing a Super Regional, I don't know what to tell you, but there was something a little extra there, I felt, with Notre Dame. And Tennessee also kind of had to play that way all season. Everyone came in there wanting to be the team that took down Tennessee. And like, that can be really taxing. And do they want to go through another season just like that one? Maybe, we'll see. But I do think maybe there will be some, I do think there will be some lessons learned, and maybe like a little bit of, hey, let's pick our spots a little bit. And so, heat of the moment being what it is, maybe that won't be the case. But I suspect maybe we'll see a little more of a measured approach to that kind of intensity from them.
Yeah, it looked like they sort of got hit back a little bit, and they had a hard time responding. I mean, they got shell shocked, and when you're just that aggressive and you win that many games, and then suddenly there's some adversity for real adversity for the only time all season, because at no point, even if they lost games or you lose the games to Kentucky, it wasn't changing anything. You were still going to win the SEC, and yeah, it was like the ultimate spoiler, because the entire route for Notre Dame was sort of that disrespect thing. It's like, you're going to send us to Statesboro and we should be hosting and we're not. And oh, we get Tennessee in the first round too. I mean, they were sort of on a tour at that point.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, it was a perfect foil for. It's also that Notre Dame team was like 23-year-olds, so it's like, I think on some level it's like a bunch of grown men who are just like, like, we say all you want, like, we're not responding to you. We're just going to go out here and take care of our business in a way that a 19-year-old might be a little more inclined to respond emotionally and lose control there. And Tennessee just loved that type of atmosphere, so they kind of thrived in it, right? So yeah, it ended up just kind of being the perfect foil. I will say, like, I get asked all the time, or at least last year I did, about my kind of thoughts on Tennessee. And the thing I go back to is, was some of it kind of like a little much? Sure, you could make that argument. I might as well. But in the end, it's like, who are they hurting? That's kind of the one thing. But then the second thing about it is, I will always be willing to kind of defend a coach whose players really ride for him.
Okay,
And
yeah.
It's not just the guys who really thrive. I mentioned Drew Gilbert, Jordan Beck, like those guys who are really intense players. I've spent a decent amount of time covering that team. It's a fairly easy drive for me from North Carolina to get there. So I've spent a decent amount of time covering them the last couple of years. And I've talked to players who aren't necessarily those guys, some of the quietest guys in the roster, and they absolutely ride for Tony in a way that seems extremely genuine and is not just canned responses. And so, again, I understand where they became the heel and they liked that role, but it's also going to be hard for me to really be overly critical of a coach whose players say things about how much they know that he loves them and wants the best for them and really goes to bat for them in a way that, sometimes we're not sure happens in a college setting, where, these players seem disposable in some cases, especially in this era of the transfer portal and all that stuff. They say a lot of really good things about him. So I'm always going to be willing to at least extend some benefit of the doubt there.
How have they been able to replace some of those guys you mentioned that are gone? I mean, we know about the pitching staff; they've got studs all over the mound. But just in general, on paper, how are they sort of replacing the guys, and what do you expect there?
I think they're still going to be really good offensively. Like, the thing about it is, I mean, they truly, coaches talk all the time about, well, we've got 12 guys we really like, and it's like, well, how true is that really if push came to shove? They were in that position last year. They had, Blake Burke hit 14 home runs and like 95 at bats. I mean, that's insane. That's like a 30 plus home run pace, which if he does that, like, holy moly. But he's not the only guy. Like, they had Jared Dickey, who, might catch for him, might be an outfielder. He hit almost 400 and battled injuries all year, was kind of in and out of the lineup. He's a full-time guy this year. Christian Moore was similar. I think he had 7 home runs and about 115-ish at bats, and they just didn't have places for these guys. They were kind of cycling them through at DH and other things, but ultimately just didn't have spots in the lineup for these guys. So there's that piece. Those guys are going to get 240 at bats or whatever if they stay healthy. The other piece is this program, and this is, I think, what makes this program should scare other SEC programs about Tennessee, is that it's not just that they recruit well, that they do. It's not just that they get guys they want out of the transfer portal, which I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Maui Ahuna from Kansas, who hit 400 in the Big 12 and is like a plus defender at shortstop, and I think is exactly the right type of player to succeed in a place like Tennessee. But they also do that in the transfer portal. But they're also a really good development program. Like Trey Lipscomb last year went from role player to one of the SEC's best hitters. And maybe that doesn't happen this year, but they've got a couple guys who fit that bill. The biggest one is Kyle Booker, who's a super athletic outfielder with like, a rifle for an arm. It's like 95 plus from the outfield, and a plus runner, and just a really good line drive swing. And, he kind of strikes me as a good table setter type of guy. So if this is a program that's going to recruit like they do, use the transfer portal like they do, and also develop players like that, usually teams are doing two of those three things at best, right? If they're doing all three, that makes them really, really tough.
I'm going to get down, spend 45 minutes on Tennessee if I don't move on. Vanderbilt, Florida, where do you sort of see 2-3? What order there behind Tennessee in the East? And then just in general, kind of where is Florida's program right now, in your opinion?
Yeah, Florida's in need of a little bit of a bounce back, right? I mean, it's all based on standards, right? Because for a lot of programs, what they've done the last 5 years would be great, but they've been eliminated in a home regional each of the last 2 years, which is obviously not where they want to be. And last year, okay, they ran into Oklahoma, who was playing its best baseball at that time, and so okay, tough draw there. But the year before that, they lost in a regional that had South Florida and South Alabama. They was just got really like blown off the field in 2021 in their home regional in that elimination game. So certainly a team in need of a little bit of a bounce back, just to get some juice back in that program, because it kind of did feel like that they've been a little flatter the last couple of years. And I don't cover that program day to day, so I couldn't really put my finger on exactly why there, but I do think it is a little bit undeniable that it just hasn't quite been the same. What I like about this team, though, is it does feel a little bit more like kind of some of the classic Florida teams. Like the talent on the mound is now undeniable, and they're not having to kind of squint and hope for some guys in the way that in previous rotations they kind of did. And I think the big thing is obviously Hurston Waldrop from Southern Miss, a guy that you saw pitch in that super Team USA guy, 14 strikeouts per 9 inning at Southern Miss. Like, he was already an SEC arm, and now he's going to be pitching in the SEC. And that's important just for his sake in general. But then I also think the important piece there is it puts a little less pressure on Brandon Sproat, who was a 3rd-round draft pick last summer, really stepped up. When Barco got hurt last year, Sproat stepped in as the ace and did a really good job. He's a great arm. It's, a fastball approaching triple digits, but he doesn't miss as many bats as you would think, given that he's throwing almost 100, and his secondary stuff is still kind of a work in progress. And so he doesn't, like I say, he doesn't miss a ton of bats. He doesn't really tend to dominate games the way you think he might. And so if he starts to do that, we're talking about an elite rotation. But even if he doesn't, if he's just the same guy he has been, if he's your second best arm in your rotation, you're in pretty good shape. And they've got a third guy in Pierce Coppola, who had a back injury last year, was a highly regarded recruit in that incoming class, missed most of last year except for one start, but he's been like 95, 97 in the fall, and they really like what they see from him. So that's kind of classic Florida, right? I mean, there were days when like Jackson Coar was their Sunday guy or whatever, that's kind of classically Florida. And then with the lineup, they've got a centerpiece in Wyatt Langford, hit 26 home runs last year. And they've got a lot of guys who do a lot of things well. Josh Rivera and Colby Halter, BT Riopel, who's just a big, power hitting catcher who's, pretty, what you're going to get with him. Right. And so that strikes me as kind of like a little bit of a classically Florida team in a way that maybe the last several haven't been, but we'll see. We're going to have to kind of wait and see on that, because it's not like they haven't been talented the last several years.
Vanderbilt obviously a loss with Christian Little, and they've got some frontline guys, but is this a typical talented College World Series level Vanderbilt team, or are they somewhere just below that?
Yeah, I think for me personally, I mean, we've got them ranked 10, which suggests like right on the outside of that. And that's, I think that's about right for me. You love the front end guy, Carter Holton. Great. Absolutely.
Saw him in Hoover. He's awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, he's excellent.
Yep. He's check. Okay. They got that. And they've got a ton of just guys that names, that are on the pitching staff, right? It's Thomas Schultz, and it's Nick Maldonado, and it's Patrick Riley. It's just kind of a matter of how do those pieces fit together, because those three guys in particular have been guys that it feels like their roles have been kind of shifting, and it's not really exactly sure like what the best thing is for them. So on the mound, it is kind of a classically talented Vanderbilt team. It is just kind of a matter of fitting those pieces together. I have some more questions about the position player group outside of Bradfield, who is incredible, obviously. And if he adds more power, like you're talking about an SEC player of the year type of guy, like don't look now, hit 8 home runs last year. And if you're going to be a guy who can hit 10, 11, 12 home runs and steal 50 bases, that's obviously a unique threat in college baseball. But I do have more questions about their position player group. But I do also think that they strike me as maybe a team that needed a little bit of a reset and might get it this year. They'd had a group of guys who had kind of been together that, maybe were on the roster in 2019 on the national title team, but weren't playing a big role, or maybe their freshman year was in 2020 right after that national title, that had been together for a few years, and it just hadn't quite. I mean, they got to the CWS finals in 2021, but that was kind of a rocker and lighter type situation that was bringing along the offense at sometimes. Yeah. So it just kind of felt like maybe it was a group that needed a little bit of a reset, and they've got it. So it also wouldn't shock me to see that that's maybe not as talented a position player group, but is a better baseball team, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you can buy, if they were a stock, I feel like you could buy them a little lower than you normally would a Vanderbilt team. They're not as scary. They're good. I mean, if they win the whole thing, sure, nobody's going to be overly shocked or anything. But at the same time, and maybe it's said something about the SEC when we're talking about LSU and Tennessee and everybody else, where they've just slid down a little bit just because so many more teams have so much talent through the portal and the way they have done it. Is South Carolina a regional team?
Yes, is my
Okay.
Let me give. I was about to do a whole bunch of caveats, but let me yes. Let me start there. Aaron likes him a lot more than the rest of us at D1 baseball do. I don't think I'm telling tales out of school there. Like he would cop to that. But I do still think it's probably a regional team. I think they're going to have to fight for it. Like I don't think it's going to be the type of deal where they cruise in. The thing about them is that their pitching staff does have a chance to be elite. Will Sanders, Team USA guy, has a chance to be a first round pick. Like, got it. Jack Mahoney was a guy who was a reliever with an ERA of like 1.5 2 years ago, had Tommy John, didn't pitch last year. If he's back in form they're going to try him in the rotation. If that clicks, got it. Noah Hall got drafted last year out of the rotation. He's back. Eli Jerzenbeck is a freshman who was really, really good in the fall. They really, really like him. He's the type of guy that you see in college baseball periodically, I think, where he might start the year as the midweek guy or start the year in a relief role. And then you look up in May and he's starting in the SEC. Like he could be that kind of guy. So you like that. Matthew Becker's a guy I should mention too, kind of a versatile reliever guy who could be stretched out or close games or something like that. The question is going to be, what do they get offensively? And it feels like South Carolina has kind of bounced back and forth from a couple of different approaches. Back in 2021, they had an offense that was really home run reliant. You might remember Wes Clark being their big bad, but they had a handful of guys like that who felt a little all or nothing. And then last year they actually finished last in the SEC in home runs last year and tried to be more athletic. And I don't know if that really necessarily worked all that well. This year they've gone in with the transfer portal on offense. They've got Caleb Denny from Oral Roberts, who started his career at Arkansas, actually. Jacob Compton from Memphis, who's a good player. I feel like I'm maybe forgetting Gavin Cassis, who is at Vanderbilt, actually, and didn't see a lot of run there, but is a really talented guy. And if that group clicks, I think they'll be good enough offensively. But if this team's really good, it's going to be on the mound. I would be shocked if it's the inverse there. But I do think they're going to be able to do enough on the mound to get into a regional.
Just a quick thesis paragraph on Georgia.
If Jaden Woods is a legit Friday guy, I think they've got enough to maybe flip-flop that pecking order with South Carolina, because I like their offense better than I like South Carolina. It's an old offense. It's not going to be the most exciting offense. It's not going to be sexy, I don't think. But like 1 through 9, they're pretty solid with a bunch of old guys offensively. And I think if Jaden Woods is a real Friday guy, I think that's probably enough.
I get asked this all the time, and I don't cover the sport nationally, so I'll ask you, and I know you've been asked this every offseason for the last 20 years probably. Why is Georgia not better? They have everything. Why is that program? I mean, because it's not like Scott Strickland's a bad baseball coach. He's done a good job at Kent State. He knows the sport. They have all that talent in Gwinnett and Cobb counties. They have the Hope Scholarship to help out from an 11.7 standpoint. What is it, just from a buy-in standpoint, that prevents them from being more competitive than they are?
It's a good question, and let me start off by saying, like, I don't really know. Everything you hear beyond this point will be me speculating. I've not done the reporting, so I don't want it to come off like I've got some hard and fast fact. But I think One theory that I've heard posited is kind of similar to a theory that I hear about the West Coast, because I get asked all the time too, like, why is the West Coast not as, and there's a million reasons for that, not the least of which is like Jacob Gonzalez plays at Ole Miss, not USC, right? Like, and he's not the only SEC player
Yeah, sure.
like that. But part of it, the one theory that I've heard, and this tends to be from people who work more in the evaluation scouting community, is that there are so many, that area is so heavily scouted that if there is a player who's good enough to play in the SEC, he has been identified at 14 years old, 15 years old, and has been so heavily scouted and picked apart that everybody sees him. So it's not just Georgia being able to sit on a guy. Like, every team in the SEC saw a kid in Atlanta, to say nothing of teams in the ACC and the good mid-major programs, whatever. So there's a lot of competition. And then also, like, MLB teams tend to not miss on kids from Atlanta. And there's in those other counties around Atlanta. So that's one theory that I can at least, okay, that seems like on an edge case. Sure. Like, I get it. I mean, the other thing is though, like, you just kind of look at, I don't know if you've ever been to Foley Field, but it's not Mizzou in terms of being behind. But in a world where every program in the SEC has done a relatively major overhaul in the last 10 years for the most part, like, it just is, you look at Foley Field and you look at some of what the rest of the SEC is doing, and these two things are not necessarily the same. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to put it all in facilities, because I think there's an over reliance on looking at facilities and saying, like, this is why this team is good and this is why this team is bad. But I do think it can be an avatar for kind of where, the focus is athletically. So again, that's just me speculating on my part, but I do think you can look at that and maybe read some tea leaves on where the focus is or is not.
The bones of Foley Field is actually, they're the exact same bones that Swayze was before any of the renovations. Ole Miss and Georgia had the exact same concourse, press box, stadium expansion. And then even when Georgia renovated theirs a few years ago, they came to Oxford and looked at where Swayze was at the time and different things. And then, I mean, maybe bad is too harsh, but they just didn't do a very good job with it. It just didn't turn out like you thought that, maybe they didn't put as much money into it. I don't know the particulars of Georgia, but yeah, you kind of got done and went, I don't know, it didn't look like what it could have looked like there. It just didn't do quite enough. And then there's also, it's not just stadium, it's, it's hitter complexes and performance facilities, especially in the SEC now, the way that stuff is going crazy. So yeah, I definitely get both those points. Shifting over to the West for a second. We are all talking about it. I mentioned Christian Little, Tommy White, this LSU team. Where's the weakness? If it doesn't work out, why?
I'll say defense first. They don't. What were you about to say? Were you about to give me an out there or something?
I was making a point there that it was taking you a minute to come up with something.
Yeah. I mean, that's yes, exactly, precisely. So I think that the most obvious one is team defense. They were not a good defensive team last year. I don't suspect they will be this year. Tommy White, by all accounts, is a hard worker, and I've talked to him. He wants to be a good defensive third baseman, but there's a difference between wanting it and being it. I think he could be better than Jacob Berry was last year. I think he's a little more natural there, which is not to say he's going to be a high level third baseman. Jordan Thompson, their shortstop, a lot of errors last year. They get saved a lot. Now they do have, like, for my money, the best defensive first baseman in the country in Trey Morgan. And I think he's going to earn his keep over there this year. I think, he's probably maybe the most valuable player on the team just kind of for that reason. But so that's the thing. I think they fielded like 962 last year, which is just not, the SEC across the board is typically 970 and above. And it was them and A&M that were kind of at the bottom of that. So that's one. Two, though, is if you really want to nitpick, and let me be clear to your listeners here, this is nitpicking. I could see a scenario where the pitching just doesn't click quite as much. Yeah. We can sit here and concoct scenarios, right? Paul Skeens is a really good arm. He's not pitched out of the Mountain West. He has really good stuff that I think is going to translate to the SEC. Let me be clear about that, but it's different. He's going to face a level of hitter that he's not had to face 1 through 9 in his career. Now, you could also counteract that by saying that the Mountain West has a lot of really offensive environments. And so, okay, I hear that. But I covered Team USA the last 2 summers, and of course he wasn't this time around, but the previous year he was on Team USA between his freshman and sophomore years, and he's made a leap, yes, but it was not across the board at the time. The evaluators that I talked to that were all in on him as a pitcher. Now, I think some of that has changed. Like, let me be clear about that. But at that time, there were some people that weren't 100% sold on it. So could you see a scenario where he's a good pitcher in the SEC, but not a true Friday guy on the level of, name your SEC ace? Like, sure. Thatcher Hurd from UCLA is coming off a back injury. What is that like? He hasn't pitched in a while. Now, he was excellent when I saw him last year, so it's the real deal if he's healthy, but okay, there's that. And then you're talking about some guys that were in the program last year that, Ty Floyd had his moments, but, was in and out of the rotation, and Grant Taylor, is going to be in a new role starting. And so I like the arms. But is there a scenario where it's just kind of an okay group versus an excellent group? Absolutely. Now, what I will say is that, hiring Wes Johnson as a pitching coach is a real highlight. I mean, that just shows when you talk about commitment, LSU going to get a big league pitching coach as a little bit of the icing on the cake there, kind of shows you where they're at. And so I do think we have to allow for, because everywhere Wes Johnson has been, like the pitching staffs have improved in short order. So I think we do have to allow for some of that there. But again, we sat here and just were able to kind of concoct a scenario where it's, a middle of the pack SEC pitching staff as opposed to one that's leading the way.
Yeah, it's one injury. It's a hamstring that has a hard time getting healed for one of the hitters. And then is this probably accurate? No, but yeah, there's a world where they don't have one of the top 10 arms in the SEC. I mean, that's doable. I mean, possible,
100%.
Maybe. I mean,
100%. No, 100%. 100%.
And then the West is good. So you struggle for a few weekends, and suddenly, 20-10 turns into 18-12, and you're not the number 1 overall seed. You're the 6th overall seed, and then you run into an arm on a weekend. And I mean, Tennessee will tell you things happen. I mean, it's not.
Yep, absolutely.
It's not a guaranteed thing there. I'm trying to save Ole Miss here, so I'll do this. Arkansas A&M. How do you sort of separate them? And is A&M going to play any faster this year? I would really enjoy that if we could get A&M to just actually get in the box, throw a pitch. I think Ole Miss played like 7 games, maybe 5 that went over 4 hours last year. It was basically just every A&M game and then like 2 other ones.
Yeah, I got bad news on that, Chase.
I know.
It's largely with A&M, yeah, I guess that's fair. Largely the same lineup. Moss and Targach and Bost and Jordan Thompson in center, and I'm missing a name or two, but Trevor Werner. So like it's largely the same lineup that kind of succeeded playing that way last year. The difference for them is I think they're going to be a little bit better on the mound. Last year, I think this is where that coaching staff really kind of made their money last year, and Schloss and Nate Yeske, like they really papered over some stuff on the mound last year. Like Detmer was really solid. I'll give him that, but his ERA was almost 5. It was 4.99, right. I think. And Jacob Palish, the reliever that was just like a Band-Aid over everything. They just put him in every game and when they needed him, and he was great. Micah Dallas had some big innings, but there wasn't really anything on the mound that really wowed you with A&M necessarily last year. And I think that might change a little bit this year. Detmer has the looks that Kendall got on him in the fall were electric. So it seems like he's taken a step forward. They brought in a Purdue transfer, Troy Wansing, who's like results weren't that good last year, but the stuff is really good. Mm-hmm. Chris Cortez is an electric arm for them. That's been up to, I think he touched 99 last year, 46 times or something like that. I mean, it's something insane. So I think the arms are across the board better. We've got A&M at 5, just behind Ole Miss actually. And it's largely based on the idea that they're not going to be quite so dependent on having to score runs and grind out games. And so with Arkansas, I think the difference is there. Look, we talked about this on our top 25 podcast. I'll just speak for myself. I'm at a point with Arkansas where I don't really care what the personnel is. Like, I'm just going to kind of assume that they're going to figure it out, and they're either going to be in Omaha or they're going to be knocking on the door of it, because they've done that so often recently. And it's not even like they haven't had issues in the past, right? I mean, it's not like these rosters have been so good they're just undeniable. Like they just find a way every year. I mean, there's years where the pitching is thin. There's years where the offense is over reliant on 1 or 2 guys, and they just always kind of find a way. Now, that being said, if we want to have a real conversation about the personnel, I think for them it comes down to is Jackson Wiggins ready to be a little more reliable in the rotation? I
Mhm.
really like Hagen Smith, the guy who was a freshman last year, the lefty, who's really good. So I really like that. I really like Brady Tigert on the back end. He can really spin a breaking ball. But is Wiggins a more than a 4 or 5 inning starter who occasionally has these really disastrous starts? Can the results kind of match up to his arm talent? Because the arm talent is obviously off the charts. So that's it for me with Arkansas. Is this finally a team that you look at and they feel a little bit deeper on the mound? Because that's ultimately it's felt like that's been their bugaboo for a little while now.
Yeah, because I mean, last year, I mean, they ended up finishing third in the country. They essentially probably win the national title if they get by Dylan DeLucia and Ole Miss there on that one day. And yeah, they did it all without Peyton Pallette. So I mean, the entire season from that standpoint. And I was sitting in the press conference, I guess, when they got eliminated last year, and you could see Dave Van Horn. And there's obviously a pretty big rivalry between Ole Miss and Arkansas, so I'll be a little careful with my words here because of Ole Miss fans mostly listening. But you sort of really feel for him because I don't know how you ever overcome what happened to him in 18 with the ball in the air to win the thing. And it felt like he was having this huge deflating moment sitting there in that press conference when Ole Miss knocked him out. Because I think in his mind, he thought that was the national title. I think he thought either one of them would beat Oklahoma in the next 2 days. And there was just a certain resignation about him that I feel like every year when they get eliminated, it's just like one more little dagger that still is more related to 18 than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, you yeah, you couldn't really blame him for asking a lot of big picture questions about life and your purpose and all that kind of stuff. Just when you talk about 2018 and last year, right? I mean, last year, if they win that game that was so close, so tightly contested, that they're probably lifting the trophy. And then in 21, they have far and wide the best team in college baseball, and it just doesn't happen. They just ran into a team of destiny in NC State, or what we thought at the time was a team of destiny, and looked like it for a while. But yeah, I mean, and I wonder, I think of Mike Martin, and towards the end of his run, he would get asked all the time, which had to get old. Like, let's be honest, it had to get old when people would ask him about, how do you feel like you need a national title to cement your legacy, or to this or that or the other thing, and he would say, and I think it seemed sincere, he would just kind of say, a long time ago, I just got to a point where I realized, like, I don't need that. And I don't need that to validate my legacy or to be looked at in a certain way. Like, I'm kind of happy with the way my career is. And so while I don't doubt that Dave Van Horn has he probably does have a lot of moments where he just wonders what if on these little things that have happened, most notably 2018. I do wonder, he's been in the game long enough now. I do wonder if he is starting to kind of have that perspective, because you couldn't blame him for having moments of wondering, like, is this ever going to happen? Because they've been on that stage so often. I mean, in my time covering college baseball, they haven't won any national titles, but you could make a real argument that they've been in terms of getting into the College World Series, the preeminent program in college baseball, right? So, yeah, for his mental health, I hope he's gotten to a point where he's kind of, not hanging on winning a national title to validate something in his career, because obviously he's, one of the great program builders, even going back to Nebraska, one of the great program builders in the sport.
And he still has a chance to win one. I mean, like I said, they're in it every single year. You don't know. I don't think he's done in the next 48, 2 years or anything along those lines. He's going to go a little longer. And, outside of in-state talent, there's an argument that maybe that's the best job in the country. They've got NIL, they've got the bordering state stuff that really helps bring in talent, the facilities, the money, the excitement. I mean, you could easily make that a top 1-2 job, depending on how you want to do those metrics. If you were just trying to rate every job in the country from that standpoint. I mentioned them at the opening just for being better. What are we making of this Alabama team?
They might have, of the teams in that middle class of the SEC, they might have the highest floor for me. Like, they don't have a superstar in the lineup, but they have 9 really good players. And if Andrew Pinckney's maybe the guy who you look at, he's center fielder, like, he might be the guy, if they have a star, he might be the guy who ends up being that. In the rotation, they bring back 2/3 of what they had last year. And, and everyone has kind of slid down a spot, because they've got, Grayson Hitt was their Sunday guy. Now he's probably more like a front of the rotation guy. Ben Hess was maybe going to be a rotation guy last year, had a freak injury, didn't come back until late in the season. Pitched his best baseball at the SEC tournament. So he's back in the rotation. So they've kind of got guys who last year were having to pitch on Fridays and Saturdays who now are more like Sunday, Tuesday guys. And so that obviously always bodes well for a program. So their ceiling is pretty limited, I think, because they don't have that big time, unless it's Grayson Hitt or Ben Hess, and it could be we just haven't seen it. But without on paper that big time Friday guy who's going to be maybe the best in the SEC, or without a superstar in the lineup that everything revolves around, like Dylan Cruz or Wyatt Langford or whoever else, I just don't know what that ceiling is. But this is a team I trust that is not going to bottom out. I also said this the other day, that they're an old enough team. They're also not going to be a team that's going to dump a bunch of midweek games. And so if they're a team that's on the bubble, or if they have a really good season and they're on the hosting bubble, like, I don't think they're going to be a team that's going to be held back because they dropped a midweek game to a team that has an RPI of 165. And I think that always kind of helps raise a team's floor, because you and I both know that, like, dumb stuff like that happens that we can never foresee when we're predicting a team's future, that, you know, a midweek game where they kind of just go through the motions ends up being what undoes them.
They also get Kentucky and Missouri. So if you could just pile some wins, you play from the East. I mean, yeah, they're the team that maybe they screw up somebody's thing. I mean, they Ole Miss was not playing well, but they swept Ole Miss in Oxford last year or whatever they did. But yeah, you could definitely see regional team 15-15, even a 14-16 kind of deal where they get in and, you know, kind of see where it goes from there. But yeah, it's hard to go, hey, they're going 19-11 in the SEC West. It's like, yeah, I don't know. That feels.
Yeah, that feels a little rich. That feels a little rich. Yeah, I agree.
State pitching, we mentioned it. What's there? How are they going to kind of get through this thing on the mound?
Well, Cade Smith was probably better last year than I realized, if I'm being honest. I've gone back and looked at it. And so if he's just what he was last year, I think they're in okay shape on Fridays. If he takes a step forward, they'd like it even more. The questions are behind them. They're going to, at least on paper, roll out with a couple of veterans who just haven't necessarily taken on the biggest roles the last few years. Parker Stinnett, Casey Hunt. Those are good arms. Those are veterans. There aren't going to be guys that are going to shy away from the moment, but they just haven't done it. So that's the kind of the way they're going to go. They got a Memphis transfer named Landon Gartman, who is like a 89-92 fastball guy who throws a ton of strikes. Like, you know what you're going to get, but he's not going to be an electrifying SEC level arm. And so if he ends up in the rotation, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world, but I do think it might be an indication that, you know, option A maybe didn't take, you know, and they're trying some different things. So that's just ultimately what's going to control Mississippi State's season, I think, because the position player side's in pretty good shape. You know, you've Luke Hancock behind the plate, dependable guy, and Hunter Hines isn't legitimately an SEC player of the year type of player if he has another year like the last. And they did well in the transfer portal. Colton Ledbetter, very different kind of player from Sonny DeShera. Let me be clear.
Yeah,
he's from Samford. Yeah, like he could have that type of level of impact. But, you know, whereas I maybe could have beat Sonny DeShera in a foot race, although probably not, actually, if I'm being honest. Like, those guys are always better athletes than like folks like you and I realize, you know, just being a Division I athlete. But very different type of player, Colton Ledbetter, but he could have that kind of impact on their offense. And so I really like the offensive pieces. But man, there's just a wide berth of what to expect on the mound. But it's going to be, they're going to roll with veterans first and see if that takes.
I rattle on and on about them every day, but from an Ole Miss standpoint and the 10,000 feet view, what do you sort of see with this group? I mean, obviously, Hunter Elliott moving to Friday seems to have the mentality for it. Everybody's in love with Grayson Saunier. I think he probably will end up being the Saturday starter on this team. They're really banged up in the bullpen with Mallett's out, Riley Maddox out for another season as well. They're going to have some young guys kind of step there. And Ken, you mentioned somebody being better probably for the whole season, and I'm giving him credit for. You don't really know what to do with Jack Doherty. They don't know what's going to take completely and where he was going to be, even though he was so good late in the year last year. I do have some pitching questions a little bit, but, you know, I like the lineup a lot. I'm going to let you tell me a little bit about Calarco, about Groff, some of the new guys coming in from that standpoint. But it's going to be an older group. It's going to be an experienced group. Should be a pretty high-end, top of the lineup guy. Gonzalez back, obviously. And I guess this happens around the country, but I don't know that I've covered it before. Without anything overly crazy, it's very likely Ole Miss loses all 8 position players after this year, either to draft or exhausted eligibility. I don't think any of these 8 starters are back in 2024.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it like that, but yeah, you you might be right, which I think is a little bit of a how do I put this? that to me, that speaks a little bit to what surprised me about this team when I first started really looking at you think about this stuff year round, but for me, it was like I kind of put last year's team away and then looked back at it this fall and in the winter and was kind of surprised, like, oh wow, this actually a lot of familiar faces here. And there were some things that could have gone differently, right? Like, TJ McCants could have decided, I think you talked about that on your show with Neal last year. Like, nobody would have blamed him if he'd have, moved on and just said, let me do something different. Whatever the next step is, let me do that. Peyton Chatagnier didn't have the year he wanted to have. Like if his year was something different, like could he have had professional opportunities? Yeah. So there were some things that could have gone a different way, but I was kind of surprised by just how this team is kind of old again. Right. And so I have one of the big questions about Ole Miss that I've thought a little bit about, and you could speak to better than I, is that I think about the Mississippi State team last year coming off of a national title. And yes, they had injuries, Landon Sims most notably, but some bullpen guys also. But it was clear based on the results there that even if they'd had better health, I don't think that team was going to be the team that we thought they were in the preseason. It's easy to say now, but that seems pretty clear to me. And I think about losing guys like Tanner Allen and Rowdy Jordan from their lineup. And I do wonder a little bit with guys like Elko, Bench, Graham, just really steady guys. Elko, a cold hero. Bench, one of the more underrated offensive players in the country, frankly. And then Graham being the guy whose return to the offense really kind of spurred things. You could replace the production, I don't want to say easily, but that's pretty simple. But do you kind of lose some like soul of the team a little bit? And that's something that you and I consider and talk about forever, and we'll never be able to say anything definitive until they take the field. But that's kind of something I've been thinking about is, are the players just as good or almost as good or something like that? And just it not quite be the same. That's kind of a big question that I have about this team that, you might be able to speak to a little bit more, but I wonder about that a little.
Yeah, because it's who are they looking to when the adversity hits? It's not necessarily even the spark plug. Like Chatagnier makes them go, no matter where he's in the lineup. He's always going to be frenetic and have energy, and he's going to be that guy. But Elko and Graham especially, they were sort of the guys that kept the eyes up from everybody. Hey, look at it, we're okay here, and it's not a bad thing. And I'm not criticizing him because you've got to be who you are, and it's going to make him one hell of a pro. But that's Jacob Gonzalez. He just goes about his day, and he's quiet, and he stays to himself. I mean, he kind of did a big double fist pump when they won the national title last year, and that's the only thing you saw from him all year. It's not how he operates. So he's not going to be that big time team leader from a vocal standpoint. I think where I lean toward that, and it's putting some pressure on him, but I think he can handle it, is Calvin Harris. He switches from first base outfield to catcher. He's a boisterous guy. He plays hard. If anything, he plays too hard. He doesn't stay healthy sometimes because he doesn't know anything other than all out every single day, every single thing. It's just what he does. He's got to stay healthy behind the plate. But I think given his position, the emphasis that staff puts on the catching position to be a leader, they got that with Dunhurst last year. I think that he's the one that maybe fills some of that gap, even though it's not going to look like Elko. But I think there's an importance there for sure with him. And then, do you get a little more of a leadership step out of somebody like Kemp Alderman, who's should have a really good career, really good year, hit a lot of home runs. And actually, he's gotten better behind the plate. Should something happen to Harris, I think Alderman's the backup catcher and will actually be kind of okay back there. It's not it's not too shabby. No, there are pieces. There are pieces to them that I like. If they can get the bullpen arms, kind of find it, whether it be some of these freshmen, JT Quinn throwing the heck out of it, or whomever it is, and then just sort of fill in roles. I'm eager to see if he stays healthy, and he's what I think he is. I'm kind of eager to see Ethan Groff in the SEC for a full season. I think he's going to have a good year.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. Like the American Athletic Conference is not what it was 5 to 7 years ago, but it's still a very good league, talented players. And he really was on another level offensively, really good athlete, probably going to play center field, which says something because Ole Miss has other guys who could theoretically play center field. So they don't have to just shove him into center field. So he's that. Like, I think he's going to be a real catalyst. He's got some pop in his bat. Not as much pop as Calarco, like in a raw power sense,
sure,
because that's going to be what Calarco does. Like that's he's raw power. And I think just by virtue of not playing games in the Big Ten, I think is going to be helpful for him. I mean, they're playing a lot of road games. They're playing a lot of games in really crappy weather. So that's tough. But it turns out Northwestern had some talent. They've got transfers, and I won't name them off because I'll forget somebody, but they've got 5 or 6 guys who are transferring to other major programs. And so that was a probably missed opportunity there for Northwestern. But regardless, I think Groff's going to be an exciting guy. And I think he's a guy who can kind of make things. Let me back up. You talked about last year I remember hearing you talk on your show about there for a while, the offense got really stagnant, and it was just like they would score 4 runs and it was 2 solo home runs and a 2-run homer. And he's the type of guy, and Shotney is this guy too, but he's the type of guy that keeps your offense from getting stagnant because he's not swinging from the heels. He's got some speed. He can make things happen on the bases. He can push the issue. Like, he's not just going to go up there trying to do one thing. And I think that there's a lot of value in that.
Just kind of curious here. I know I've kept you probably longer than you expected, so I'm kind of wrapping up. But Ole Miss's non-con is interesting. They play a lot of Big Ten games. They actually play Maryland 4 weekend games in a row. They've got them in Oxford for 3, and they're going to Minnesota, and they open up with Maryland there as well. A team that obviously had a resurgent year last year as well. What are we making out of Maryland, and then anything to either Purdue or La Tech as well in that non-con? I know you're SEC now, but just kind of curious.
No, I mean, it's a really good schedule. First of all, are you, it's a little early, but are you planning on going to that tournament in Minneapolis?
Yeah, I want to see it. I was there. I went there when they used to do the Dairy Queen Classic in the Metrodome, and I kind of want to see the baseball in US Bank. So yeah, just because of the novelty of playing there, I kind of want to go.
It's wild. Like, I went there in 20, I guess it would have been 18, maybe 18. Mm-hmm. It was the year Minnesota was really good, like super regional good. So 18. And it's pretty wild. Like, the press area, because it's a football stadium, is like on the surface of the moon. You know, it's like, it's just, you are way up there. But it's a cool deal. Like, I recommend it. It's wild. Like, it's kind of a strange setup, but regardless. But it's a good non-con schedule. Maryland is really good. We've got them, what are they, 13 in the preseason, Big Ten favorites. And for me, it's not really close in the Big Ten. Rotation is really good. Nick Dean, Jason Savacool. Savacool's the prospecting name to know there. It's a hard, like, turbo sinker, like mid-90s turbo sinker kind of guy. It's an SEC type arm. He would be pitching on the weekends for, choose your SEC team, really, outside of a couple. He would be there. So, and the other thing is, they've got a really just a really old physical offense. They've got one guy, Matt Shaw, who like lit up the Cape Cod League over the summer and is probably going to be a first-round pick. He's our shortstop and hits for some power. He can run. He's a good athlete. Like, he's not like a super rangy, like he's, maybe like 5'10", 5'11", like stocky. So he doesn't look like super fluid, but he does the job there. But outside of him, like, it is a lot of really strong physical guys who just hit the ball really hard. They've got a grad transfer from Bryant, who was their conference player of the year last year. They've got Luke Schleiger, their catcher, who's a little bit prospecty in his own right. He runs well for a catcher, like takes a bunch of walks, like has some power. It's just a really tough lineup 1 through 9. And I saw them in a fall game against Virginia, and it's just on another level from what you see in the Big Ten these days. Now, Michigan's had some good teams. Obviously, they came one way from national title, but this, to me, talent wise, is just on a level above what you see in that conference at this point. So, Ole Miss is not going to be able to, even at home, just kind of show up and expect to be able to dominate that series. And so I will actually be in town for that one. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. Purdue, don't know what to expect. Purdue is on the come a little bit. They kind of had a big rebuilding job the last couple of years. You may remember last year they got off to something like a 17-0 start or 20-0 start or something. And it was, I don't want to say fraudulent, that's too strong, but they played nobody, which is not to say they weren't good. They were pretty good, but they weren't great. So that's more of something I think Ole Miss should be able to, on talent, be able to handle that a little more routinely. And La Tech, like, Lane Burroughs really has that program going. They're starting to dabble a little more in the transfer portal in a way that I think they've typically been a JC program, a program that kind of recruits JC. Mm-hmm. They're dabbling in the transfer portal now, and it's real guys. Like, they got Raleigh Hector, who was a big recruit for A&M a couple of years ago. Brody Drost is probably a name that from LSU. Right. He's there now. And they're another team that, like, I look at their roster every year and do that thing where I'm like, how is he still in college? Like, they've got 5 or 7 of those guys, including their Friday guys, a guy named Jonathan Fisher, who's like I don't mean to be mean about it, but he's kind of a bad body left-hander with just okay stuff, but is like just really competitive and throws a ton of strikes, and they're tough. Like that's a team that's probably an at-large type team. I mean, whether they win the auto bid in the league or not, like they're probably going to be an at-large team. And let's not forget, it was a program that hosted a regional 2 years ago. It's kind of easy to forget now because they didn't win that regional, but hosted a couple of years ago. And that's kind of I don't think they're that good again, but that's kind of what this program is operating from now.
Yeah, you got that in the non-con, and then at Ole Miss, the very end of the schedule, the last 4 weeks are relatively easy going on an SEC level. But Ole Miss at Vanderbilt, Florida, at A&M, Arkansas, at State, LSU, the first 6 weeks of SEC play. So quite the first 18 in the SEC there for the Rebels. This was awesome. Love to do it as we keep the season going and get here February 17th, Ole Miss and Delaware. As we said, new things going with D1 baseball. So for people interested in the SEC Extra, we've got a lot of D1 baseball guys, SEC Extra guys. Where can they find that? What do they need to do?
Yeah, just d1baseball.com, hit that subscribe link. You can use the code SAVE23 to get you 20% off. So please do that. Monthly subscription, yearly subscription, whatever works for you works for me. Like I said, we're going to try some stuff this year. We're going to throw some stuff out there and just throw things against the wall to see what sticks, metaphorically speaking. So I can't promise you what all we'll be doing, but I can promise you we're going to work really, really hard to try to bring the most comprehensive coverage of SEC baseball that we can. And we're willing to have some fun stuff to try. This is going to be, we're hoping to cover college baseball in a way that it's really never been covered before, which I know is lofty, but it's a sport that's growing. So there's a lot of stuff that just hasn't been tried. So we're going to go out there and try it. So if you want to jump on board with us, we'd really, really appreciate it. Again, just go to d1baseball.com, hit the SEC Extra tab, and you'll be right there.
Awesome stuff. Really appreciate it. Look forward to all the work, and let's talk again.
Appreciate it, Chase.
All right.
That was Chase Parham, Joe Healy of d1baseball.com. That does it for this edition of Hand Raised Guys, presented by Comer Heating and Air, Southern Air Conditioning and Heating. Again, this will be the Friday Oxford Exxon podcast. Our thanks to Jeff Johnson of OStateIllustrated.com, also to Joe Healy for his time tonight on the show. We will be back on Monday with another edition of the Oxford Exxon podcast. We'll recap Ole Miss, Oklahoma State basketball, and, of course, we'll recap Championship Sunday. It's the Niners at the Eagles, the Bengals at the Chiefs. Should be a really fun day of NFL football on Sunday. We'll have recruiting coverage over the course of the weekend. We'll have some recruiting wrap-up stuff on Monday as we get closer to the second and very secondary signing day on Wednesday. So for Chase Parham, I'm Neal McCready. That does it for Hand Raised Guys. We will talk to you on Monday morning with another edition of the Oxford Exxon podcast. Until then, have a great weekend. Take care.